dragged him to the library, reluctantly, I might say. And she came to the desk with him and she said, my son has to do a term paper. Can you help him? And I said, I'll be glad to. I turned to Josh because I wanted to ask him. I said, what do you have to do a term paper on? He said, American history. I said, well, that's a little broad. Has your teacher given you any subject to do it on, or a group of subjects where you pick one? Nope, she just said do it on American history. And he goes, and I hate history. And I said, that's fine, that's okay. I said, what do you like to do? Well, I'm into baseball. I said, great. I said, why don't we go find some books on the history of baseball in America? I could do that? I said, well, it's part of the history of America to write about that, or some other sport, whatever, and how, or maybe what sports were popular in colonial America or something like that. Really? And so I took him to the section, helped him pick out some books. His mother called 2 weeks later and said he got a B+ on that paper. He's never gotten a B in anything, ever before.
Excellent. Well done. Okay, hit that one out of the park.
Could you have the next person stand up and face the audience? So we
I will do that. Thank you. Good suggestion. Okay, let's start.
This one is kind of a tough one.
Now you have to stand up and face the audience.
I don't mind doing that, but I worked on a reference desk in Utah, and a gentleman came in once a week, a man named Bruce came in once a week and asked for printouts of male movie stars, Rock Hudson, John Gavin. And sometimes he would come in and he would ask for the same ones we printed out for him the week before. And my colleagues wanted to say, well, we shouldn't do this anymore. He's asking for the same movie stars. And I said, so what? This was something, a service we provided. I gave him the same one as week after week. Sometimes he'd ask about movies and things too. But one week he came in and he pushed his request on a piece of paper across the desk. He wanted information about a movie or a movie star, I can't remember. And he also wanted information on suicide. So I said, okay, well, let's look up the movie star first. And while I was doing, I said that, but I was really looking up information on what to do if you think someone's contemplating suicide. And so I had the list in front of me, the steps you take. You sit them down, you ask them, are they thinking about hurting themselves, and so on. And so I printed that out, and then I found information about the movie star. And I took that in my hand, and I took the printout, and I said, let's go sit down and talk about this. And I sat him down, and I said, what the printout said, are you thinking about hurting yourself? And he said, yes. And so I talked with him, and I brought him to a study room, and I said, I want you to sit in here for just a minute. I'm going to go get some help. Is that okay? And he said, yes. And I called the police. First I called the suicide hotline, and I asked, what should I do? And they told me, and one of the things was to call the police. And the police arrived a few minutes later. In the meantime, while I was waiting, I went in and I spoke to him again, and I said, now, Bruce, I've called the police because they're going to help you, and I don't want you to hurt yourself. And he said, okay. He said, thank you. And they came, and they were very kind. And he always had a little satchel with him. And as they began to escort him out, he put his satchel down and gave me a hug. And then went on his way. It's hard for me to tell this story. So I found out a few weeks later from his sister that he was going to be all right, that he'd gotten the help he needed. His problem was that he was homosexual, gay man, in a society that was not particularly tolerant of gays. And he had this struggle going on inside. And I was able to listen to that struggle and tell him he was a fine person, and we always were glad to see him come in the library. So that's my story.
Good story. What I try to do every time I hear these is say, how can we craft this to tighten up? I start, well, why the pictures every week? I mean, why?
He probably felt guilty my guess.
Okay, very interesting. That's a good straight, because there's a little question that kind of lingers there. That's interesting. I keep saying that often you're walking through the grocery store again, somebody comes up and they say, "How's life in the library?" You go, "Oh, it's okay." Or, "I saved a man's life today." Okay, at the library. Karen?
Have to stand up?
Please.
Okay. I was a speaker for 5-year-olds some years ago. And a little guy, Hamilton, was sitting on the front row, and all the little kids had white mortarboards, and all of them were pretty straight except Hamilton's. And it was sort of like this, and Hamilton was sort of leaning in the chair. Now, the only problem with that was his mother was director of the daycare center. His one grandmother worked for me. The other grandmother was on the library board. And so they're looking at the stage. I see them looking at Hamilton, and they're going, you know, he didn't get it because he was almost practically out of the chair. Now, I was doing the story, the great blueness and other things, to tell the children they were going to make the world a more beautiful place. And Hamilton was sitting there sliding out of his chair, looking up and seeing. Fast forward, 2 days later, his mother came in with Hamilton, and she said, "Hamilton wants to check out the great blues." She was still ticked. So we checked out the book, and his mother took the book home. Now, she had more brains than I had, a wonderful woman, ran a wonderful daycare, but she was not a hell of a reader, I gotta tell you. She took that book home, and she read it to Hamilton. And he told her, "You can read all you want to, but only Miss Walters in the library knows the real story."
It's funny, one of the things that I keep trying to figure out is trying to take all these stories and make them really short. Now, notice that none of these are like a minute. So the problem is that here in North Carolina, you folks do have a tendency to want to pad it. But that's not a bad thing either. So, you know, the thing to play with sometimes is like, so how do you take these things and spin them down even shorter? You know, because we really do need to start, you know, if it is our job to gather stories and tell stories, let's start gathering our own. Because they are so profound about, nobody can tell a story like they can at the library. Anybody else with another? Sir.
How many of you know about Don Davis? Storyteller, master storyteller, teaches how to give stories. Has classes down at Chincoteague, down at Baldhead Island, on the Ocracoke. Don used to have a church here in High Point. And the bishop came up, a Methodist bishop came up to him and said, "Don, you've got to decide. You're either going to be a minister or you're going to be a storyteller. Which is it going to be?" Don decided to be a storyteller. Each and every one of us are storytellers. This story, Kay Anderson and I were standing out of the library about 5:15 to 5:30, and this fellow comes up and he says, "I've got to get some IRS forms. It's April the 15th. Where do I get them? Where is the first post office?" We said, "Sir, if you were to run down to the post office, the Emmerwood branch or the main post office, and you found them open," of course they're not because it's after 5 o'clock, "you would not be able to get IRS forms in the post office anymore. But walk into the library and they will have IRS forms for you. If you need any more help, come see us. We'll be right here to help." Story.
I'll go back there and say, what does that have to do with the minister? Nothing. Okay, just chop that piece off and go right to the next one. Okay? Okay, anybody else? Ma'am?
Would it be okay if I stay back here?
You bet.
Right here? Okay. I'm sorry, taking my chance here. Okay. NJ is a very frequent library user. However, she is one of those drive-by library users. She's running in, running out. The woman has 3 jobs, 1 full-time, 2 part-time, okay? Doesn't have a whole lot of time for chit-chatting, you know?